Good evening, how are you? It's great to be learning with you on a Monday and President's Day. So thank God we live in a country where we're free to learn and teach. And we celebrate, I guess, well, it's Washington and Lincoln, right? It's not all presidents. I don't know. Someone will educate me. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. And who is with us on a federal holiday and a Monday evening learning? Joe in the Inland Empire, Yehud in South Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Shandor in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Steven in Maine, Patrice in Utah, Joseph in Massachusetts, Leon in Southern Illinois, Peggy in Colorado, Renee in Indiana. Feeling better. Not all better, but better, Baruch Hashem. Thank God, Renee. Good to hear you're feeling better. Paula will watch the class this second time around, wishing everyone shalom and happiness. Melissa checking in from Great Neck, and Marjorie in Atlanta. Welcome, everybody. All right, today we're finally going to conclude our discussion of Mishna number 3 here in Chapter 4 of Tractate Nazir. This is the 17th volume of the Talmud, the laws of nazirus, taking the vow of nazirus to abstain from products of the grapevine, cutting one's hair, becoming impure for the dead, and becoming obligated to bring the offerings that a nazir brings upon the conclusion of nazirus. This Mishnah number 3 was what happens when offerings are set aside and then the Nazir no longer needs them. So, for example, if a woman takes a vow of Nazirus, sets aside animals or money to buy the animals at the conclusion of her period of Nazirus, and then her husband nullifies her vow for her before she brings those offerings. So what happens to the offerings? A Nazir, upon the conclusion of their term, brings a sin offering, a burnt offering, and a peace offering. The burnt offering and the peace offering can be sort of repurposed, right? A burnt offering can always be offered to God. It's kind of a gift offering, an elevation offering. A peace offering can always be repurposed as another peace offering with some nuances of difference. But a sin offering cannot be repurposed ever. No way. Can't be done. So if somebody sets aside a sin offering for himself, either because he's atoning for his sin or procedurally because it's part of the offerings that he brings at the conclusion of Nazirus or after his purification from Tzara'as. In any case, any kind of sin offering can only be used by the person who set it aside for the specific purpose for which they set it aside. And if for some reason it can no longer be used for that purpose, then if it was money set aside to purchase a sin offering, that money's thrown in the Dead Sea. If it was an animal set aside to be a sin offering, that animal is left to die. At the end of yesterday, we were analyzing in some detail this idea that if one set aside money to purchase offerings at the conclusion of Nazirus, so the money was designated for offerings generally, but it was not allocated to specific offerings. So that's called unallocated funds. And if that person no longer, if a woman was a Nazir and had her vow nullified, or if a man was a Nazir and he had his vow nullified by a halakhic authority, or a person set aside these animals or these funds, for the conclusion of Nazirus, and then he died, right? So he can no longer use it. So if it wasn't set aside to be a sin offering, it can be brought as general gift offerings. If it was set aside to be a sin offering, then nothing can be done with it. And that's the difference between allocated funds and unallocated funds. And then we were looking at sort of other items of value that could be set aside for this purpose. And we discussed silver bars and construction beams. And all of those things, basically, they're going to be sold, and the money that is raised through that sale will be used to purchase offerings, and that's the same as unallocated funds. And then the kind of sticky question, is a blemished animal. So what if somebody set aside an animal to be brought as that offering at the conclusion of Nazirus, but it's a blemished animal, meaning the animal has some imperfection that causes it to be disqualified for being brought as an offering on the altar. All of this, of course, is only when the Holy Temple is standing in Jerusalem. It has not been standing for 2,000 years, and no offerings have been brought in 2,000 years for that reason, and no one is able to vow nazirus now for the same reason. At any rate, if it's a blemished animal, it can't be brought on the altar, and so a blemished animal is understood to be just like bars of silver or beams of construction or otherwise unallocated funds. A blemished animal is going to be sold, and the proceeds of that sale can be used to purchase offerings, but we don't say that if that animal happened to be of the type of animal that could be brought as a nazirus offering but became blemished, that therefore it is like allocated funds or like a designated animal. We don't say that. Rather, a blemished animal has the same, is understood to be like money for this purpose. It's like unallocated funds. And at where we pick this up today on page 28a near the top, basically the Gemara is bringing in a baraisa to challenge this idea that a blemished animal is understood to be just like money, just like unallocated funds. So we're kind of in the middle of stating this long baraisa, and then eventually Rava is going to bring his challenge, right? He's stating the whole baraisa, and then he's just going to use a small part of it for his challenge, that is it really true that a blemished animal is like unallocated funds? But along the way, we're learning this baraisa. It's from another place. And the idea of this baraisa has to do with sin offerings generally, and the idea that if your father had set aside an animal to be a sin offering and he died before he could bring it, the son inherits the father's property. And even if the son has committed exactly the same sin, requiring the same sin offering for which his father set aside an animal, the son cannot use the father's animal that was designated for a sin offering, because a sin offering, an animal set aside to be a sin offering, can only be used by the person who set it aside and for the particular sin for which he set it aside, or if it's a procedural sin offering, for whatever the specific purpose, right? If the father was a Nazir and he set aside this animal to be the sin offering of a Nazir, so the father could use it for that, no one else can, right? And it can only, and if the father set it aside, and if a person set aside an animal to be his sin offering because he made an unwitting transgression of Shabbos, an unwitting violation of Shabbos, and then, later in the week, he made an unwitting violation of eating a prohibited fat. Can he use the animal set aside to be a sin offering because he violated Shabbos, to be his sin offering because he ate something that violates the laws of kashrus? No. Anything that's set aside for a specific sin offering can only be used for that sin offering, as we shall see. So now we understand what this baraisa is being brought for, and why we're getting into the weeds on this subject, and then hopefully we won't be confused as we finish our way through this somewhat complicated baraisa. But again, it's being brought to challenge this idea that a blemished animal is like unallocated funds. So the baraisa that we were learning yesterday about an animal designated for a sin offering can only be used by the specific person and for the specific sin offering. Now, one might have thought that he does not fulfill his obligation with the money that his father separated, like his father separated money to be used for a sin offering, same idea as an animal designated to be a sin offering. One might have thought that he does not fulfill his obligation with the money that his father separated if it is from money the father set aside to atone for a minor transgression, and the son atones for a minor one also, or from money the father set aside to atone for a major transgression, and the son also is atoning for a major transgression. However, the son may fulfill his obligation with the offering he separated for himself. From animals he set aside to atone for a minor transgression, he may atone for a major one, or from animals he set aside to atone for a major transgression, he may atone for a minor one. You might have thought this. Therefore, the verse states then he shall bring for his offering a goat, a female without blemish for his sin. That's Leviticus 4:28. And what does this teach us? It indicates that this man, this son now, does not fulfill his obligation unless his offering is for the sake of his particular sin and not for some other transgression. You can't use the animal or the money you set aside to purchase the sin offering animal that was for a Shabbos violation. Now I'm going to use it for my own violation, let's say, of eating prohibited food. No. Once you designate an animal or money to purchase an animal, it has to be for a particular person, for a particular transgression, or for a particular procedural sin offering. Now, one might have thought that he does not fulfill his obligation with the animal he separated for himself. From animals he set aside to atone for a minor transgression to atone for a minor one, or from animals he set aside to atone for a major transgression to atone for a major one, or even went from animals he set aside to atone for a minor transgression to atone for a major one, or from animals he set aside to atone for a major transgression in order to atone for a minor one. And the reason is that if he separated an animal to bring as an offering for unintentionally eating forbidden fat, and he instead brought that sin offering for unintentionally consuming blood, or if he separated an animal to bring as an offering to atone for blood, and instead he brought it for eating forbidden fat, in that case, he has not misused consecrated property, as the animal cannot lose its consecrated status. And just as it cannot lose its consecrated status, so too it cannot be redesignated to atone for a different sin. And therefore, this animal also does not atone for him. However, one might think that he fulfills his obligation with the money he separated for himself from money he set aside. You might think, well, if I set aside an animal to atone for eating a prohibited fat, and I use it to atone for unintentionally eating blood, okay, it doesn't work because it's an animal. But what about money I set aside to purchase a sin offering for unintentionally eating blood, and instead I'm going to use that money to purchase a sin offering for unintentionally eating a forbidden fat? Very similar type of transgression. Maybe this I could do. You might think that you could do that, and the reason is that if he separated money for himself to purchase a sin offering to atone for unintentionally eating the forbidden fat, and he instead brought a sin offering with that money for unintentionally consuming blood, or vice versa, just as it can lose its consecrated status, it can be redesignated to atone for a different sin. Therefore, this money atones for him if it was used to purchase an offering for a different transgression. You might have thought that. Therefore, the verse states, for his sin, which indicates that he does not fulfill his obligation unless his offering is for the sake of his particular sin, and he is not permitted to use money consecrated for one type of sin to atone for a different sin. And this concludes the baraisa that Rava was bringing to challenge this idea that a blemished animal is like unallocated funds. So finally, Rava asks his question. In any event, this baraisa, which was teaching about a particular animal and particular funds for a particular transgression of a particular person, stated at length, but that was what the baraisa was all about. So that baraisa, in the course of its teaching, taught that a son may not use an animal separated by his father for his nazirus offering. Makes sense? Now what? Is it not referring even to a blemished animal, right? The baraisa might have said that a son cannot use the unblemished animal that his father set aside to be his offering of nazirus at the conclusion of nazirus, and then we would have understood, okay, it's just unblemished animals that are fit for the altar. But since the baraisa was just worded as the son may not use an animal that the father set aside, well, maybe that includes blemished animals, and therefore we were wrong to assume that an unblemished animal is equivalent to unallocated funds. Rather, maybe a blemished animal is like an unblemished animal. That's Rava's challenge. Since the baraisa did not differentiate between types of animals, this indicates that a blemished animal has the status of allocated funds, as opposed to Rav Nachman's ruling that this animal is like his father's unallocated funds, right? Unallocated funds, since they were never designated for a sin offering, they could be used to purchase a burnt offering. The son can't use it to make his offerings at the conclusion of nazirus if he also became a nazir, but at least they can be used for something. Whereas allocated funds, the portion that's allocated to the sin offering, has to be thrown into the Dead Sea. Right? So that's why Rav is making this challenge. How can Rav Nachman assume that a blemished animal is like money and is like unallocated funds? Maybe a blemished animal is like an unblemished animal. But the Gemara rejects Rava's challenge and says, no, the baraisa refers solely to an unblemished animal that is fit to be sacrificed. Only an animal of this kind is considered allocated. And the Gemara asks, well, however, according to this explanation, what is the law of a blemished animal? Is it considered like an unallocated animal? If so, why does the baraisa specifically teach that one may purchase an offering with the unallocated funds that his father separated? Let the baraisa teach this law with regard to a blemished animal, and one would infer that the same applies to money. And the Gemara answers, as above, so too this is the case. There is no difference between the two. And the reason is that what is a blemished animal fit for? It is fit for its value. And this value is essentially money, right? A blemished animal can't be brought on the altar. It can only be sold and the proceeds used to purchase other offerings. So it's like unallocated funds, meaning designated to purchase offerings, but not allocated to specific offerings. So a blemished animal, it's not like you can sell it and use the money to go to Vegas. You can sell it and purchase other offerings that'll have to be brought, but at least we don't have to take part of that like a sin offering and, if it's an animal, leave it to die, or if it's money, throw it in the Dead Sea. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 4, which we were on for several days. Now, Mishnah number 4 of chapter 4, very interesting. The previous Mishnah discussed the case of a husband who nullified his wife's vow, right? And that's why these animals that had been set aside to be brought as offerings were no longer needed. That's how we got into that whole discussion. Now, this Mishnah, number 4, deals with a husband who nullified his wife's nazirus after she had completed her term and brought her offerings to the temple. Because probably that's when he heard about it, right? He didn't know that she had made a vow of nazirus. And when he heard about it, he said, oh, no, I nullify that vow for you. But at that point, she had already completed her nazirus and brought her offerings to the temple. So then what? What does it mean that he's nullifying her vow after she's already completed the term of a nazirus and has brought the offerings to the temple? Now, she hasn't sacrificed the animals. She's reached the final stage, right? She's brought the animals to the temple. And the question is going to be, what's going to happen to these animals, right? So if the blood from one of her nazirus offerings was sprinkled on the altar on her behalf, the animal's already shechted, right? It was already slaughtered, and the blood was sprinkled on the altar. That's just part of the sacrificial process. So the husband cannot nullify her vow at this point. That's when it's too late. Rabbi Kiva says, even before the sprinkling of the blood, he cannot nullify the vow as soon as one of the animals for her offerings has been slaughtered on her behalf. Once the animal has been slaughtered, it was slaughtered as a particular kind of offering. Now it's too late to nullify her vow. And the Mishnah continues, in what case is this statement that he can no longer nullify the vow? In what case is this said? It is said when she is bringing the offerings for her shaving of ritual purity, meaning she has completed her term of nazirus without becoming ritually impure. However, we know that if a nazir becomes impure for the dead, steps in a cemetery, has somebody die right next to them and then helps out, renders first aid, and then comes into contact with a corpse. In that process, they didn't do anything wrong, but they're not allowed to become impure for the dead while they're nazir. So as we've seen, one who is in the midst of his term of nazirus and becomes impure for the dead has to do what? Bring the offerings of impurity, shave the head, and start all over. Start counting all over again the days of Nazirus that they vowed to be a Nazir for. They have to restart the whole count of days. So what we're learning here is if the wife completed her Nazirus and she's bringing the offerings that a Nazir brings at the conclusion of Nazirus, once one of those animals is slaughtered, then it's too late to nullify her vow. But if she became impure for the dead and she's going to have to reset her count and she's going to shave her head and bring the offerings of impurity and then start over, at that point the husband can nullify her vow and she's not going to have to do, the do-over of her days of Nazirus after bringing these offerings of impurity. He can nullify her vow at that point. And the reason is that the husband can say, I do not want a downcast wife who does not drink wine. And she would have to refrain from wine for a lengthy period if she were to begin her Nazirus again. So Rabbi Meir says the husband can nullify her vow even at the stage of her shaving of purity, meaning at the conclusion of her Nazirus, after she has begun sacrificing her offerings, as he can say, I do not want a shaven wife, right? I do not want a bald wife. She has to cut all her hair off. And this husband could say, I don't want my wife to be bald. So even if she's completed her Nazirus and had the animals slaughtered on her behalf, but she hasn't shaved her head yet, the husband can step in and say, I nullify her vow because it affects him, right? He doesn't want a wife that is prohibited to drink wine, or he doesn't want a wife who is going to have a bald head when he has an option not to have that. So he can nullify the vow. That's Mishnah number 4. Perhaps there will be comments about that. Okay, here's the Gemara on Mishnah number 4. The Gemara comments, the Mishnah which rules that a husband cannot nullify his wife's Nazirus after the blood of her offering has been sprinkled on the altar at the end of her term of Nazirus is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. As if it followed the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer, didn't he say that shaving, meaning shaving off the hair at the end of Nazirus, is indispensable for the end of a term of Nazirus? I.e., a Nazir at the end of his Nazirus is prohibited from drinking wine and becoming impure from the dead until he actually shaves. Even if they finish the count and brought the offerings, if they still haven't shaved the head, they're still prohibited to drink wine or become impure for the dead until they've completed every stage of the Nazirus, according to Rabbi Eliezer. And in this case, since she has not yet shaved, she remains prohibited from drinking wine. And since she becomes downcast through her abstinence from wine, evidently the husband can nullify her vow even after the sprinkling of the blood of her offerings of purity. And now we're on 28b. Now, why is this relevant that the husband doesn't want a downcast wife? The reason is a husband can nullify vows of his wife, not necessarily all vows, right? The husband, as we saw earlier, has the right to nullify a wife's vows, right? Or has the, remember, it's a leniency for her that he can nullify her vows for her, because otherwise, like anybody else, she'd have to go seek out a halakhic authority. She might have to travel to another city to find such an authority to nullify the vow for her, whereas her husband can just do it at home. We think, it's so patriarchal that he's nullifying her vows for her, but it's actually a leniency for her. However, he can't nullify just any vow for her. He can only nullify vows for her that somehow impact their domestic situation. So how does her vowing to abstain from wine or become impure for the dead, how does that affect him? Right? It only affects her. She can serve him wine. It's not that she can't touch wine. She just can't consume it. Right? But he can say, well, wait a minute, we like to have a glass of wine together, and when we do, we're both in a good mood, and it's nice for our marriage. And now she can no longer do that, so it affects me. And that's what gives him, that's the lever that he uses to, that the sages have said, allows him to nullify her vow of Nazirus. Okay, so now we're on 28b. So the Tana of our Mishnah holds, once the blood of her offerings has been sprinkled on her behalf, so now she's immediately permitted to drink wine. And therefore, she's not going to be downcast if this particular woman gets downcast when she doesn't have wine. So consequently, the husband has no right to nullify her nazirus vow at that point, as her vow does not affect him. If she's able to drink wine once her animal is slaughtered, see, this is different than Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says she can't drink wine until she's brought her offerings and shaved her head. But the Tan of our Mishna says, no, as soon as her offerings have been offered, then she can drink wine, even if she hasn't shaved her head yet. So consequently, the husband cannot nullify her vow of nazirus. And Rabbi Akiva holds, even if the blood has yet to be sprinkled and wine remains forbidden to her, as soon as an animal is slaughtered for one of her offerings, the husband can no longer nullify the vow. Why? Why is it the husband cannot nullify her vow after one of the animals has been slaughtered if she's immediately able to drink wine, so that part of it doesn't affect him? And the reason is, once her animal is slaughtered, if he then nullifies her vow, then a consecrated animal was slaughtered for no purpose. And that's not allowed, right? Now you can see, once we recognize this perspective, this point of view that the sages had, that we're never going to allow a consecrated animal to go to waste, how reticent the sages must have been to say, well, the animal designated for a sin offering and it can't be brought as a sin offering, that animal has to be left to die. It's not like they were, cruel in a cavalier or casual manner. They hated to do that. They just couldn't find a way around it. But here we're seeing that Rabbi Akiva says, well, once she's brought even one of her animals, even if the blood hasn't been sprinkled on the altar, but as soon as it's slaughtered on her behalf, he can no longer nullify the vow, because now that animal is part of her process of concluding her nazirus. Right? So even if the blood has yet to be sprinkled and the wine is still forbidden to her, as soon as the animal is slaughtered, the husband can no longer nullify the vow due to the loss of consecrated property. Now, Rabbi Zeir objects to this. And why should the result be a loss to the sanctuary? We could say that the husband could nullify the vow, and that animal that was slaughtered, but its blood hasn't been sprinkled yet, well, let's bring it for a different purpose. Now, you can't redesignate a sin offering of one person for another. You can't even redesignate a sin offering brought by the same person for one sin to let it be atoned for a different sin. But that's the law of sin offerings. Burnt offerings and peace offerings can be repurposed. Right? So says Rabbi Zeira, and why should the result be a loss to the sanctuary? He can avoid this by sprinkling their blood, not for the sake of the offerings of a Nazir. We could sprinkle the blood for a different purpose, like presumably a burnt offering or a peace offering, and he will thereby permit the meat of the offering to be eaten, right? So if it's eaten, it's going to be a peace offering, or maybe a Thanksgiving offering, not a burnt offering. So sprinkling their blood, not for the sake of the offerings of a Nazir, and he will thereby permit the meat of the offering to be eaten, and the consecrated animal will not go to waste. And isn't it taught in a baraisa with regard to the communal peace offering of 2 sheep that accompanies the 2 loaves on Shavuos? If one slaughtered them not for the sake of that offering, or he slaughtered them before their time, before the festival began, or after their time, after the festival had ended, the blood shall be sprinkled. Although not for the sake of that offering, as it is no longer fit for that purpose, the meat may be eaten as a kind of general peace offering. And if it was Shabbos, the blood may not be sprinkled. Since the meat cannot be eaten on that day, sprinkling the blood is considered a form of unnecessary labor on Shabbos. And if he sprinkled the blood on Shabbos anyway, the offering is accepted, and he must wait to burn its sacrificial parts on the altar in the evening after the conclusion of Shabbos. In any case, this shows that it is permitted to sprinkle the blood of an offering not for its own sake, ab initio, so that its flesh can be eaten. Right? So we're challenging what Rabbi Akiva said, that if she brought her animal to the temple and it was slaughtered, at that point the husband can no longer nullify the vow. But Rabbi Zayer is saying, well, why not? He can nullify the vow. We're just going to now, even that the animal's been slaughtered, we're going to redesignate it to be a different kind of peace offering, and then we can still sprinkle the blood and, use the animal and not waste a consecrated animal. And the sages answer to Rabbi Zera, if he had slaughtered only the woman's nazirus offerings of the burnt offering or the peace offering, so too he may certainly proceed to sprinkle the blood not for the sake of that offering to avoid the loss of a consecrated animal. In that case, Rabbi Akiva would agree that the husband can still nullify her vow. However, with what are we dealing here? It is with a case where they slaughtered the animal of her sin offering, right? Once the sin offering has been slaughtered, absolutely, the husband can no longer nullify the vow because that animal cannot be repurposed in any way, as we've learned several times. So the Gemara cites the source that the order of a Nazir's offerings may be changed and the sin offering may be sacrificed first. As we learned in a Mishna on page 45a of this tractate, if he shaved after the sacrifice of one of the three Nazirus offerings, either the burnt offering, the peace offering, or the sin offering, he has fulfilled his obligation. It might be that there's a standard order of what order the offerings of a Nazir are slaughtered and sprinkled, but if you do them out of order, it's not going to cancel the process. Now, the Mishnah taught, in what case is this statement that a husband cannot nullify his wife's vow said? It is with regard to a shaving of ritual purity, meaning offerings brought at the end of the term of nazirus. However, with regard to a shaving of impurity, right, the woman became impure for the dead in the middle of her term of nazirus. She has to bring offerings for that, and then they're going to restart she shaves her head and restarts the clock, and she has to do her whole nazirus over again. So if those offerings are being brought, the offerings of impurity, the husband can still nullify the vow, even if one of those animals has been slaughtered and his blood sprinkled on the altar, right? Because all it's going to do is reset her nazirus, and we know that he can nullify her vow of nazirus. He may even nullify the vow at her shaving of purity, because he can say, I do not want a shaven wife, right? So this is a different view, that even if it's her vows at the, even if she's bringing her offerings because she's concluded her nazirus, forget the offerings of impurity in the middle of nazirus, even if she concluded her nazirus and she's bringing animals and they've been slaughtered and the blood is sprinkled, where Rabbi Akiva says, that's it, no more, you can't nullify, this view is opposed to that and say, well, if she hasn't shaved her head yet, even if she brought the animals, even if they were sprinkled, even if it was a sin offering, the husband could still nullify her vow because he doesn't want her to shave her head, because that does affect him, right? It's her head, but the husband looks at her. I'm not a Nazir, obviously. Nina likes my head like this, right? She cares how I look. So you see that the appearance of a spouse does have an effect on the other spouse. And so it makes sense, this view. And the Gemara analyzes these opinions. And the first Tana could have said to you, in response to Rabbi Meir's argument, it is possible for her to compensate by wearing a wig, and therefore she would not appear shaven, and her husband would have no cause for complaint. And Rabbi Meir holds, well, as for compensating by wearing a wig, since it is dirty, he is not amenable to this solution, and he may therefore nullify her vow. You could say, well, come on, she can always put on a wig. Who are you to nullify her vow because you don't want her to have a shaved head? And the answer is, well, in the society of 2,000 years ago, maybe wigs were not as high quality as they are now. So he says, no, a wig is no substitute for her hair. I want her hair, not a wig. Interesting that they had wigs 2,000 years ago. Probably not the same wig technology we have today, but they had wigs. Okay, I'm almost done. That was actually the conclusion of the Gemara on Mishnah number 4. Now we're on a new Mishnah. Mishnah number 5. We're going to read the Mishnah, and then we're going to stop for today. And tomorrow we'll start up again with the Gemara of Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 4. So here's Mishnah number 5. A man can vow that his minor son should be a Nazir. A father can declare that his son is a Nazir, as we saw, but the son has to ratify it. You can't make a vow on somebody else's behalf. Even your minor son, if he doesn't want to be a Nazir, your vow is canceled. But a woman cannot vow that her son should be a Nazir, right? So a man can do that on behalf of his son. The son still has to ratify it. A woman cannot even make that initial vow on behalf of her minor son. And how so? What are the details of this nazirus? If the son shaved his hair, thereby demonstrating his rejection of the vow imposed by his father, or if the son's relatives shaved him, or if the son objected by saying that he has no desire for this nazirus, or if his relatives objected on his behalf, in all these cases, the nazirus declared by the father is canceled. If the son who canceled the nazirus had animals separated for his offerings, the one set, so this is another case where maybe animals were set aside for the conclusion of someone's nazirus, and then the vow is canceled, right? The minor's son can cancel the vow. Even his relatives can cancel it for him, overriding the father's declaration of that nazirus for his minor son. So in that situation, it's that same idea that animals were set aside for the conclusion of nazirus, and then the nazirus was canceled. What do we do with the animals? So if this son who canceled the nazirus had animals separated for his offerings, the one set aside for the sin offering must die, and the one set aside for a burnt offering is sacrificed as a burnt offering, and the one set aside for a peace offering is sacrificed as a peace offering. But unlike a regular peace offering, this one is eaten for one day, and it does not require bread to be brought with it. If the son whose vow is canceled had unallocated funds, they will be allocated for communal gift offerings. If he had allocated funds for his offerings, the money for the sin offering is cast into the Dead Sea. And the money allocated for a burnt offering is used to purchase and bring a burnt offering. And the money allocated for a peace offering is used to bring a peace offering. But unlike a regular peace offering, it may only be eaten for one day and is not accompanied by bread. And that concludes Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 4. And tomorrow we'll pick it up with the Gemara on Mishnah number 5 when we go to page 29. Okay, let's see if we've got questions or comments. Here on Nazir 28. Lucy. So, the husband just learned of his wife's Nazir vow when she was all done with Nazirus, because he can only nullify the vow the day he learns of it. Exactly. I love it. The level of our class just comes up and up and up. And people, you guys are qualified to teach just like me. Exactly, Lucy. He can only nullify her vow on the day he hears of it. So he must have only heard that she was a Nazir at this point, even when she completely finished it. And so he's just going to, step in and interfere and say, well, wait a minute, I don't want her, to even have one more day of not drinking wine, or I don't want her to shave her head at the conclusion of Nazirus. And so that's why he might nullify her vow, but he can only do that on the day he hears of it. Maybe he's oblivious and he just never noticed that she wasn't drinking wine for a month or a year or however long the term was. Alice, can he divorce her? Can he divorce her? Divorce her, like, for what purpose, right? Are you saying that she became a Nazir? It's not pleasing to him that she's going to shave her head, or it impacts him in some other way. And rather than nullify her vow, he says, you know what? A woman who swears vows of Naziris is not a woman for me. And he's going to just divorce her. He could initiate such a process. He could give her a get. He'll have to pay the ketubah. It's definitely a patriarchal system where that the husband has that power to initiate divorce, and the wife doesn't, right? And that's why, in modern times, they try to write into the ketubah that she will have a right to initiate divorce. Not everyone is on board with that. But a husband who won't give a get, right? When a wife wants a divorce and has cause to have a divorce, and a husband won't give her the get, he makes her an aguna, and this is a man who will become an outcast, right? So in the Orthodox community, it's sort of like it has a different way of dealing with it. Okay, only the husband can initiate the divorce, but if he doesn't initiate a divorce to a woman that is deserving to have a divorce, he'll become an outcast in the community. He'll be publicly shamed until he gives her the divorce. Bill, actually wig technology really is mostly the same as it was for thousands of years. Bill, is there something you don't know about? Let's see. So barring synthetic materials and machine sewing, the best wigs are still made in much the same way as made in Talmudic times. I think, though, the sages are talking about lower quality and therefore more widely available wigs than many of the examples which we still have, which were invariably the property of the highest nobility and could be staggeringly ornate. So interesting, right? So I'm just wondering, I mean, I have no idea how wigs are made, but when you see certain wigs, they're just, it's so natural, it's so amazing, and it's like, I just don't even understand how they do it, they cut off all that hair and then attach it in a way that, looks so natural. I'm sure there's some technology now that wasn't available then, but I think what Bill's point is that they had beautiful wigs then, only the rich people had them, right? And there were other kinds of head coverings, which might be called a wig, or might be made with animal hair, or just might be, a poor person's wig. And the husband's like, well, you could call that her hair, but it's not her hair. It's totally distinguishable from her hair, and he doesn't want that. And that's why, he would still be able to nullify her vow. What is this? Okay, final question from Joseph in Massachusetts. Just a general question that he's been thinking about. He says, do you think, in your opinion, it is necessary to master the 13 principles of interpretation in order to understand the Talmud? No, I don't know that we can master, right? So in a prayer book, right, in a Jewish prayer book, we read every morning the 13 principles of exegetical interpretation as stated by Rabbi Yishmael. And that's just one, sort of encapsulation of our principles of interpretation. And there are other ones, as Joseph is alluding to, that there are other systems of interpretation. But the most widely accepted is this one of Rabbi Yishmael. And that includes things like a kal v'chomer inference, where if it's so in a major case, then it must be so in a minor case that's included within the major case, that kind of reasoning. Or if we find, a law or a word in two places in the Torah, we can connect the laws in which that word appears, those kinds of principles. But there are other principles that are so complicated, when a general statement is followed by a more specific statement, which is followed by a generalization. The generalization serves to amplify what the specific. I can never follow it. Honestly, those particular principles are so difficult to grasp exactly what's being said. I've never been able to understand it. And I don't even know what it would mean to master the 13 principles of exegesis or of hermeneutical principles. It's like when they come up in the Talmud, so the sages tell us what they're doing. So you don't really master the principle, right? It's sort of like, you might say, well, in order to understand calculus, I need to know what a sine and a cosine and an integer and a function and all those things are. And if I don't, how can I do calculus? And I would agree with you. But on the other hand, I think you can appreciate a poem without knowing, everything that a professor of poetry would know about meter and rhyme and onomatopoeia and all kinds of complicated things that you don't necessarily have to know to appreciate a poem. So likewise, I think the more often we encounter those, and certainly some of them come up a lot, some of them much less often. But I wouldn't say you need to master those 13 principles, if that's even possible to do, in order to grasp what's happening in the Talmud. I think what we more have to do is just dig into the Talmud, and then we immediately on any page we open, there'll be stuff that's complicated and can't quite understand where it's coming from and what exactly the sage is saying. And then we apply our kind of intellectual muscle to try and understand it and to follow the argument. That's the work that we need to do, and that will sharpen the Talmudic mind, as it were, and it'll get easier and easier over time to grasp what is being taught and we'll pick up more and more of the jargon and the kind of underlying principles that come up all the time. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Pacific. And by the way, Chodesh Tov, right? Right now we're beginning the Hebrew month of Adar. It begins tonight, and then we have a 2-day Rosh Chodesh, Tuesday and Wednesday. And this is the month of joy, right? It's Rosh Chodesh Adar. Adar is the month that includes Purim. And so this is called the month of joy. And my blessing for all of us is may we have the most joyful Adar ever. And we say Amen.